Welcome. This is the Drupal usability meeting for April 19th, 2024. I'm Benji Fisher, moderating and sharing my screen. And also present are Ralph Kohler, Aaron McHale, Offer Schall, Simo Helston, Scott, and Thomas Howell. Thanks all for coming. And I think we'll start today with this issue. It is 3296190. Support the multiple attribute for the email element. And I have a site where the current merge request has been applied. I guess I have to log in. And then where's a good place to test this? We need a form with an email element. So do I need some custom code there in order to test this?
I'm not sure. I've only looked at the two strings in question.
So let's see. I think I may do a little bit of hacking here. So on the basic site settings, there's a text area for an email address. And let's see, where would that be? I bet it's in the system module. Um, bet it's the site information form. So I'm only sharing my browser window, so you can't see that I'm opening up an editor. But let's see, the issue says type email title. So adding the multiple attribute, which before this issue would not be supported, but I'm going to add that. And then let's see what happens if I reload this page and add a second email address here. Save configuration, and it seems to have worked. It accepts two email addresses separated by a comma. And then I guess before I go on any further, any questions about the point of this issue? Anyone want more details on what exactly I did to hack Drupal core in order to test this?
I'm actually Googling about having multiple email addresses in from because that's kind of sounds weird.
So for the basic site settings, it would be weird to have more than one email address, but this is a question about the form API, and there are other contexts where it would make a lot of sense to allow multiple email addresses. Like I want to send the summary of this article to 5 different people, and I would like to enter 5 different email addresses in a form field and send it off.
I have a question. Just in case this email address isn't an email input, is that part of the test? Or is it just an input
Yes.
field? Is this just an input field with a string and therefore it'll accept commas?
I'm pretty sure it's still validated. If I change this to
I have those
%.example.com. But first of all, Simo, did I answer your question?
Email, it is.
Yeah, what I was looking at is, so this is a bit old version source actually, but if like when the examples have like a list of different email addresses in the form from, so does it comply with SMTP specification? So could it go wrong there?
Okay, and I see you've posted a comment in the Zoom chat. And a link. So
I'm just wondering if this like allows you this allows user to make something that is against the SMTP. But it seems that it's allowed, or at least has been allowed. So that's maybe we can look at how it works. No.
yeah, I'm also not sure whether that's in scope here. And I guess there's a further question of what happens when I use this field, how it's stored, and actually maybe that's worth asking on the issue. Ralph, go ahead.
And could you please try one other scenario? Change it back to the at and remove the percentage. And at the same time, after the comma, add a space and another comma. So you have an empty slot in between. That is the example that is in the open thread on GitLab.
Right. So I'm trying to pause and make sure that everyone understands the context, and you're all asking very technical questions. So I think I should get beyond that stage. Yes, everyone understands what the purpose of this is, and we're now seeing how well the current patch works. So if I save this configuration, I get please enter an email address. Which is not ideal. I've already entered 2 email addresses.
This is HTML5 validation, though.
Yes, this is when you have an email field, you get some validation for free. Inspect and input ID class required. Type is email. So yes, we get HTML validation for free. So Ralph, is that the test you wanted me to do?
Yes and no. The question basically is, why quite one requested? The review is basically the string. If it wouldn't be done by the HTML5 validation, but instead done by Drupal, the error would be, at the moment, all email addresses must be non-empty. And the default HTML message is please enter a non-empty email address, but both are a bit confusing. But at the same time, the one we've seen with please enter an email address is also not exactly and precise.
So inline form errors is disabled by default. So if it's going to be caught by HTML5 validation, how can I ever see the error message?
We can't test that with this. So we just need, we can't, the HTML5 element needs to be able to accept multiple. You could test it by installing the contrib module, disable HTML5 validation, and then we could skip the validation aspect of the test.
Oh, I didn't know there was such a thing.
Yes, there is.
What is it again? Disable
Disable HTML5 validation, something like that.
with
It's like
underscores?
fairly straightforward. Yeah. Or yeah, it's in some variation of that. We'll get it. Yeah.
Okay. And I'll go over to another window you can't see where I've got Drush, access to Drush. Actually, Composer first. Those are required Drupal and then paste in the module name and Drush enable. Okay. Let's do a force reload of this page just in case and see what happens. Try that. There we go.
So that's good.
Yes, we succeeded in seeing the string in question. Okay, so all email addresses must be non-empty. So is that what we're supposed to be looking at?
Yes.
Okay. I also noticed that the space I entered has been stripped. I don't think that's a problem. And I think in the Zoom chat, Ralph already pasted in something. That's not the message I see here. So what happens if I put in an invalid email address? I still just get the message they must be non-empty.
You'll have to step through different error types, probably.
There we go. And if I had two invalid email addresses? Okay, let's try duplicating this tab and then hitting the back button a couple of times. Um, Okay, all email addresses must be non-empty. The email address is not valid. Use the format and separate the addresses with a comma. And the email addresses, this and that, are not valid. Use the format and separate the addresses with a comma. Shall we start with the empty error message? Go ahead, Ralph.
Could you just add another scenario with a single email address, which is written in the wrong format, please?
Certainly.
Just to see if the use the format and separate addresses by comma is also appended, or it's just the first part. Okay.
So I think that's exactly the same error message as when I had two of them, one of which was invalid. Yeah.
Yep.
So let's start with the simplest one. All email addresses must be non-empty. And I guess before we think about the wording, should it be a warning at all, or should it just automatically skip any empty email addresses and give me the same thing as if I didn't have the extra comma?
Input shouldn't filter user data. Should let the user correct the data.
Even for something as easy to mistype as
It's a
typing the comma
mistype.
twice.
It's an error. It is an error on the user side.
Okay.
Also
Right, it creates a
possible.
validation error that is not empty, which is correct. The error doesn't necessarily make that clear, but
And also it's possible that there would be a use case where somebody copy pastes email addresses, adds commas, and one of the paste actions fails and adds comma, so it kind of could alert of something going wrong.
Okay.
I do think that applies for the white space removal too, but that's a different part.
Yeah, it's pretty common when processing a form to trim white space. So if that's something we shouldn't be doing, then there are a lot of changes we have to make. Okay, so the error message, all email addresses must be non-empty. Is that clear? Does the user know what to do to fix the problem?
No, it's not clear what the error was. Like, we're not seeing it right now, but you had like comma and a space, so we're not seeing it, but it wasn't clear to somebody that the space is not exactly the right thing, because it should give the same error that space is not a valid email address, right? In that respect. It's empty character, non-empty. I guess that's how they got into non-empty.
So let me just borrow this text field for convenience. You would like an error message something like this: empty string is not a valid.
Well, a quote with an and BSP character, a space character in it, which I know, because that's what it is, right?
So I guess we would want to display it as a visible space, right?
Yeah.
And if we have one that's actually empty, then you'd want to say an actual empty string and a single space are not valid email addresses.
are not valid email addresses using commas. Help to explain the fact that there's just a weird spacing in the commas. That's what we're not quite helping explain, I guess.
Okay, so I agree with you to a point. I think your suggestion does a better job of explaining what the error state is, whereas the current error message is skipping that step and going to how to fix it. And I think it has to say something about commas. But I don't like the way you phrased it, putting it all into one sentence. I would rather sort of just use the same message that we use in other parts of it and make it a second sentence. So the first sentence says what the error state is,
Mhm.
and the second sentence explains how to fix it.
That sounds good. That consistency, yes.
Other opinions?
I agree with your point, Benji. And I've made another suggestion in the chat with the addition of something like wrapped by 2 commas in the context of that space, or the 2 air quotes also makes sense.
So where would you want to add that? Wrapped by 2 commas?
Right after the second, between the apostrophes and the are not valid email addresses.
So right here?
Yeah. That way it gives a pointer for which combination of characters to scan.
Offer?
Sorry, I was a little in and out. Is this core functionality or a module? What we're seeing here.
Core.
So, because, and I'm sorry if that was raised before, but wouldn't it make sense to keep it simple as one email address and just allow more fields for email address instead of explaining to people how to use a complex field?
I think it's
Um,
because email addresses, email fields take comma separated strings.
No, I understand. Yeah,
Okay.
I understand that. I'm saying for people who are not from Drupal, right, out there in the world, fields can help us by the browser almost automatically to make sure an email address is okay. And by not trying to put it all in one field, I think we don't need to explain to people how to enter that. So it would need a button and other fields added, but I think the experience would be much simpler for most.
I agree. That actually does make sense. You're talking about cardinal fields then for each. That
I
makes
don't know if that
would make the UI cleaner.
works here. Sorry, I don't know if that works because we're kind of talking about on the form input level. So like, I think so they're like, you're thinking about like how the field UI you can add, multiple fields, but like what we're looking at here is actually like if you wanted to do that on the form level, you would have to have like multiple form elements. That makes sense. Or like kind of at a lower level here. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that well.
No, I think I understand this technicality involved, and maybe it's not something that's already baked. I'm just saying, as from a UX perspective, and what I want people to experience when they come to Drupal, I wish they wouldn't even need to learn how to use this kind of format, but be able to just put email addresses in multiple fields.
But
Right.
people outside of Drupal are familiar with this because it comes from email itself, right? It is outside of Drupal.
I'm referring to now you can add a comma. Like you all of a sudden don't have the browser telling you, yes, all these are valid email addresses. That makes
The only
sense?
reason the browser isn't telling us that is that we installed a contrib module. I think most of us didn't know about it, but Scott did. There's a contrib module that disables HTML5 validation, and we had to install that in order to see the Drupal error messages because we weren't getting to the Drupal error messages before. It was just stopping at HTML5 validation.
And with HTML5, you were able to add multiple and it would be checking each one?
It would check the email address at the same time first, yes, before
Okay.
the form submit.
I didn't know that. Okay, so I take it back.
See a
So
couple
I'm
of
sorry, I
comments.
think I missed that as well there.
I see a couple of comments in the chat. Let's save CMOS, which is another thing to test for a few minutes. And Aaron says, I thought it was a semicolon rather than a comma.
Yeah, I was just referring to like email specification. I think it's I didn't realize it was there's a comma also allowed. I thought it was just a semicolon that you would normally use to separate email addresses.
I'm not sure. Well, let's try Simo's experiment. He's got some spaces and accidentally types a comma instead of a dot. So there it's email comma com rather than email.com. So that's certainly a reasonable mistake to make. All email addresses must be non-empty. So I guess it's checking for empty email addresses before it's checking for valid email addresses. So if I get rid of the empty one, and again, notice that it is trimming spaces. Here, the email address com is not valid.
How about just remove the com and have admin at email?
Like that? Or do you want me
Yeah.
to remove the com as well?
Well, you can remove the com, but it doesn't change the result.
Yeah.
So it allows email without a TLD.
Right. I bet the HTML5 validation would catch that.
What if there is only one email address? And like remove everything after comma?
You want to keep the comma?
No. Or we could try with, let's try this first. Okay.
And let me uninstall the disable module. Little double negative there. Let me restore HTML5 validation and see what happens now. I expect it'll complain. No? Interesting. I guess my thought is that we're sort of arguing over. We're debating things that really aren't that unfamiliar. Whether it's internal to Drupal or not, separating things by comma is pretty common. And I think that most use cases, people will be happy to use whatever interface they're given, whether it's multiple instances of the email field or a single field separated by commas. I really don't think people are going to get confused by it. And a lot of the time, a single field is easier to manage than multiple fields. And Simo provides another Stack Overflow. Why does HTML5 form validation allow emails without a dot? Is the answer interesting? You can theoretically have an address without a dot in it. And it gives some examples of valid emails that don't involve dots. All right. HTML5 validation allows it because I guess the RFC allows it. Including you could provide an IPv6 host name or IP address rather than what we're more used to. Yeah, so I guess before discussing the wording of the error messages, we should settle this question. I guess Offer and Scott, if I remember correctly, both agree that having multiple fields would be a better user experience than comma separated. And I disagree. What other opinions, other arguments, one way or the other?
Well, usually when I use Thunderbird, I just copy paste from a spreadsheet, like rows of email addresses, and then the Thunderbird converts it into a comma separated list first, and then into a kind of a separate fields. So if we have something else than comma separated list, like if we have individual fields for emails, then it would be user friendly to allow to paste comma separated list so that it converts it into those fields. And that's quite a bit bigger thing to do. But I think copy pasting comma separated lists is quite a common use case.
It's not totally uncommon because historically, email clients, you would just keep adding email addresses to the same fields. And even modern clients like Outlook or Gmail, you kind of do that. They make it prettier by adding little, styling around each email, but it's essentially the same thing. I think and the other thing is like to consider is like we're not this. So what's happening here doesn't change. It doesn't like inherently change every email field in Drupal to just all of a sudden start allowing, because I think each field would then have to independently opt into this. And in a lot of cases, like if you go to add an email field through the field UI and you want multi-value, you're probably going to get like, what you would get if you added multi-value text field, which is like you get a separate field for each item. Not 100% sure. That's something we could look at some point, but I think that's, unless I misunderstood it, I think that's what's more relevant here is like that messaging that you get.
Yeah, so this is a form API change, and the form needs to declare multiple equals true in order to get the new behavior. Simo points out that we can have different widgets in contrib modules. One little experiment I want to try. I have a hard tab in there, which I got that by copying and pasting from my text editor. And I expect it won't like that because it insists on comma-separated email addresses. That's not. Oh, that's the HTML5 validation that doesn't like it. And let me again disable HTML5 validation. And since there are no commas, it interprets the whole thing as a single email address. Okay. So I was just sort of testing Simo's workflow of copying from a spreadsheet with hard tabs and pasting into the field, and that wouldn't work. So other thoughts on comma separated versus separate fields? And if there are no further comments, then we can have a vote.
Actually, just I think the option of having multiple fields could be actually another option of the field element to actually do that, then multiple, and whether they want single field or multiple cardinal fields.
Yeah, certainly the field API, we're talking about the
Shoot, can
form
be a
API
field.
here,
Right, form.
but the field API could certainly give you multiple fields. I don't know how easy that is to do with just the form API. Ralph, what are you giving a thumbs up to?
To Scott's idea. To make it a deliberate
Extend the
choice
scope.
for the person, yeah, and move it to a follow-up issue maybe. But the idea to make the distinguishment between those two options, I consider a good idea, because basically it just depends on the number of emails that should be entered. If it's 1 or 2 or 3, it's okay to do it in a field context. The other way around, provide the option with a comma separated list is as well good, especially if you have 50 or 20 in a row, then it gets cumbersome if you do it manually in air quotes via the UI.
Now let me.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, I think my concern though is that like that feels out of scope for the form API, because if you want, like, the form API is intentionally designed to be very, like, every component of it is very minimal. Like, if you want a grouping with multiple fields, you have to like set up the render array to do it. So to me, because the field UI can already do that, it seems out of scope for the form UI to have the concept of like turn on multiples, and all of a sudden you get what you get with the field UI, which is like multiple form elements working together to create that experience. You know, the button and the Ajax callback that adds the additional field, all that stuff is like a construction. What we're looking at here is an individual, a single component.
The date element does this. The date element is multiple input elements.
Oh, and the form API?
Yeah.
Interesting. I wouldn't have expected that, because I figured that would have used like Ajax callbacks and stuff that you need to set up yourself.
Arbitrary multiple, or just it allows start and end?
It allows for multiple input elements, the date to be broken apart into different inputs. You can have one date string with, like, you know, year dash month dash day, or separate inputs for each aspect of the date field.
But do you have to set up those inputs separately?
Part of the form API. Their field settings on.
Yeah, but that's different. That's not multiple dates. That's just a complex.
It's a
form
setting of
field.
the field of the element itself. It's an option of the element.
Yes, it's an
It's an option.
option to make a more complex form for a single date. It's not an option to provide multiple dates, if I understand you correctly.
No, it's not a date range. Sorry, I don't mean to say it's the date range or multiple date selection. Not right now.
Right. So that's different from what we're discussing here. That's a complex form for a date. I think I agree with Aaron that Form API and Field API have different uses, and Field API is the appropriate way to provide multiple fields for multiple email addresses. And that if the Form API is going to handle it, it should be something simpler by default. Of course, you can provide a different, I guess you'd have to override what the Form API provides. So offer had to drop. That leaves us with 6. So who is in favor? I'll count offers as being in favor of multiple fields. And Scott, I think you still are. Who else is in favor? Can you just give a thumbs up if you want to handle multiple email addresses with multiple text fields? Okay. And can you give a thumbs up if you're in favor of doing it with a comma-separated list? Ralph and Aaron and Simo and I. And Thomas is not voting. So that's 4-2 with 1 abstention. So, okay, so I think we'll stick with the way the issue is currently implemented. And we still have to decide on the wording. And I think we were reaching consensus that we should have the same format for all the various errors. We should always have the second part, and we should always start with a statement of problem. And don't treat empty as different from other invalid email addresses. Just print it out either as an empty string or a string with a non-breaking space in it. So would that handle all cases? The email address, single email address is not valid. The email address is not valid. Use the format, da, da, da. The email address is this and that are not valid.
Does it let you add like a semicolon? I can't remember if we resolved that earlier, if it lets you do that. Because I think that's also allowed though.
So let's see, we can test. I expect it'll object to this because it expects a comma-separated list, right? It does not recognize the semicolon as a separator. And if I re-enable HTML5 validation, there we go. HTML5 validation also objects to the semicolon.
That's interesting. I thought a semicolon was like was allowed because I've used that a lot of times, but interesting.
I think Outlook uses that. Probably some other.
Yeah. I mean, I've used it in other systems, like, and they're, so I don't know if that's, again, it's hard to know if that's part of the spec without looking it up. I should, or if that's just like other systems being more flexible.
Yeah,
also the
various systems
format.
can do whatever processing they want, and who was it? Simo was talking about pasting in from spreadsheets, which would give you hard tabs, I think. So there are certainly use cases and reasons for handling things that don't comply with the RFC, as long as what you send to SMTP does match the RFC.
Yeah. I wonder if, again, without checking, being, I wonder if that's something that could be like a follow-up, because again, like there is cases where maybe, yeah, I'm gonna look it up before I say anything else.
So Ralph is the one who suggested adding this phrase wrapped by 2 commas. And I suggested adding the full second sentence. And I'm pretty sure we don't need both of them. Ralph, do you still think it's a good idea to have this phrase in here? Would you rather have that instead of the second sentence, or both?
Let's take the following scenario. You have a comma separated list of, let's say, 5 or 6 email addresses. They look perfectly fine. And you just as a second comma slipped in at one point, and everything looks perfectly fine. And to figure out with that general recommendation, use the format and blah, blah, blah. It's not entirely sure where the problem is. And narrowing down the problem with that space and wrapped by 2 commas, it makes it more clear where the problem could lie, and that the person editing is focusing in the part between the email addresses. Otherwise, it's just a long list of characters. It might be overwhelming.
Oh. On the other hand, it's making the error message longer. And I sort of feel that if I'm pasting in 20 email addresses separated by commas, it's the responsibility is on me to get it right and figure out what went wrong.
True.
And the error message does sort of make it clear that there's some sort of empty email address, which suggests that I should be looking for that double comma. Any other opinions on whether we should have the phrase wrapped by 2 commas? Or perhaps separated by 2 commas? Inside 2 commas? Who thinks it should be removed and we should just use the second sentence to explain the point?
I think that actually makes more sense. I'm almost annoyed now that it doesn't remove an empty double comma, because it does remove white space. It doesn't see an empty double comma. It's white space. So I'll shake my head to the sky again.
If it would have separate fields, I think usually the empty fields in the middle, they get removed in multiple.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
I think we debated that particular point, or it came up when we were testing an issue a few months ago. I'm going to make one slight adjustment to this, especially since I noticed that XJM commented already on this issue, and I know that XJM is a stickler for grammar. Use the format user@example.com and separate the addresses with a comma. That's a compound sentence with 2 clauses, and there should be a comma in between them. And it's a sentence. It end with a period. Oh, it did end with a period. I just didn't see it. So are we done?
Yeah, and apparently, although I'm trying to skim the RFC document but failing to find it, but according to Stack Overflow, which the answer linked the RFC but didn't say where in the RFC, a comma is the only legal separating character for email addresses. So I'm happy, but I'm annoyed that I can't find what part of the RFC they were referencing. Thank you, Stack Overflow.
And that sort of attention to detail and caring about detail is exactly what we need.
Yes, exactly.
So thank you, Aaron, for caring.
I will care about the little things.
Does anyone object to my suggestion to inserting a comma here? No one is objecting. I think I'd like to leave the comment on this issue unless someone else would rather. And again, the main point is that error messages should describe the error state and give information on how to fix it. The current error message skips that first step, and we should just make the error messages consistent rather than treating an empty email address as fundamentally different from a malformed email address. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. We've got a few minutes before the end of the hour. I see a thumbs up from Thomas. Any last words before we close the meeting?
Email is hard.
I'm glad we weren't talking about dates today.
Speaking of email being hard, did you see that there was a vulnerability in SMTP discovered maybe a month or two ago?
It didn't.
And it's because SMTP is such an old protocol, it relies on line breaks to separate various parts of the message. And what exactly is a line break? Is it a carriage return line feed? And it turns out that different email processing programs have different ideas about how to treat it. And if you have, if you end a line with a carriage return and then end the next line with a carriage return line feed, it can sometimes lead to inconsistent results. So yes, email is hard. And also line endings are still plaguing us despite the fact that we're well into the 21st century. Okay. Thanks all for coming. I think I'll be back next week and hope you can all make it then.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.